Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. It's the varsity athlete Jeremy Bodette coming to you with a very, very special report outlining some incredible and disturbing claims that have been made against Vince McMahon. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple of things right from the get-go. First thing is, these are not my opinions. I am not passing judgment. I'm not claiming that any of the things that I'm about to review here are right or wrong, truth or false. That's not the purpose. The purpose of this is to take the 64 or 65 pages of the lawsuit that was filed in late January and read it, understand it, condense it down, and share it with you guys. So I don't want anybody to misinterpret this as any kind of endorsement or support of either side of this. I'm going to attempt to be as objective and non-biased as I possibly can in describing this to you, but the lawsuit itself is, of course, written in a biased way. So it's almost impossible to avoid. If my opinion is included, I'll be sure to share that very directly and transparently so that it's very easy for you guys to separate what's being claimed in the actual lawsuit versus what does the varsity athlete think about this particular thing. I think most of my opinion is going to be shared at the end of this video series. The second thing I want to mention is that this is an incredibly disturbing story. If true, if even only part of it is true, it's extraordinarily disturbing and extremely unique. The lawsuit shares testimony in very graphic detail, much of which is not included in the review that I'm going to be sharing with you in this series. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the claims, it is almost impossible to avoid a lot of what's going on. There are very detailed and disturbing descriptions of rape and other disturbing circumstances that just can't be avoided, unfortunately. So please have discretion, not just of yourself, but of those around you, and just make sure that the only people that are listening to this are people that should be listening to it. So without further ado, let's get started. This is the fall of Vince McMahon. Hey gang, welcome back to this special report on the fall of Vince McMahon. Today we are covering part 2 in this video, which I've titled The Grooming Begins. This covers the time period for spring-summer 2019. If you remember from part 1, please, if you haven't checked it out, check it out. It's called A Not So Chance Encounter. We talked about, we gave a little bit of background for Janelle. We talked about how she's in a vulnerable position. We talked about Mr. McMahon, sort of their not so chance meeting where Janelle's residence manager kind of hooks them up together. And we talked about their initial kind of weird, but mostly innocuous meeting at his personal condo. Now things really start to get interesting. And now that we've kind of set the stage with, let's see, 2/3 of our main characters in the story. So now we're going to get to part 2, The Grooming Begins. So at the very end of March 31st, 2019 specifically, Vince invites Grant back to his condo again to prep for an interview that she's doing with an unnamed employee. And you're going to see this come up a lot in this lawsuit. You know, WWE corporate officer number 2, WWE corporate officer number 4, WWE superstar even gets mentioned later in the story. So you're going to see a lot of unnamed. The only 3 people named specifically are Miss Grant, Vince, and John Laurinaitis. So Grant goes back to Vince's condo to prep for her interview with WWE corporate officer number 2, basically telling her that, I mean, initially the impression that the lawsuit gives is that she's going to go there and you know, he's going to kind of coach her through things. Really, what really basically comes of it is he tells her to tell them that she and Vince met through a mutual friend. So there's not really a lot of coaching going on, but you can see that there's kind of this relationship that's forming between them where he's kind of trying to like frame and control the picture with her. He's trying to sort of control the narrative or control the information that she shares with other people about the nature of their relationship. This is where things start getting a little creepy at this meeting. So as the conversation moves along with him, he begins to talk about how people are very intimidated of him, how people are honestly kind of even afraid to touch him, even though he is desperate for affection, especially physical affection. While hugging goodbye, the lawsuit claims that he whispers, "Feels so good," in her ear while they are hugging. So again, we see an escalation in sort of the weirdness and inappropriateness from the first meeting. The next day, on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2019, Grant has the meeting with WWE Corporate Officer number 2, and it goes very well. Basically, what CO2, Corporate Officer 2, tells her is that they just need to find the right spot for her. And after the meeting, Grant and Vince exchange a few kind of flirty text messages regarding, I think she mentions that she sees like a dinosaur skull in his office, and he kind of gets a little flirtatious with the messages back to her a little bit. I wouldn't say anything super inappropriate, but it's more playful, it's more casual, it's not very professional. A week later, on April 7th, 2019, Grant and her residence manager attend the WrestleMania show that Vince promised to give her back at their initial meeting on March 23rd. And her and the residence manager get the complete VIP treatment, which includes private transportation and a big fancy black SUV to the event. And the lawsuit states that Grant, diligently took notes. And this is the first, event that she's ever been to. Imagine having, the VIP experience at WrestleMania be your first real contact with professional wrestling. It must be just this crazy stimulus overload. You're lost and confused in the crowd and the cheers and the chants and just the massive humanity that goes on. That must be a very overwhelming experience. My personal opinion here. So I'm sure she was very lost and confused at that time. Over the next several weeks, Vince and Grant meet multiple times at his condo. Primarily, they're discussing the potential roles. The lawsuit states that, she had brought several job descriptions with her for roles at the company that she thought that she might be a really good fit for. During these meetings, he would often engage in extended physical embraces with Grant. And would repeatedly say things like, would repeatedly talk about how much he trusts her and how close their relationship is and this kind of thing. So you can see, again, the professionalism kind of melting away and is sort of being replaced by this personal, physical, and exceedingly intimate relationship that Vince is trying to establish between the two of them. In late April, Grant visited, once again, Vince's condo. I suppose at this point, she could just enter without ringing the doorbell, or maybe she knocked and the door was unlocked and she just went in. But the lawsuit basically says she's sort of paints this picture that she's wandering through Vince's condo, looking for him, maybe calling for him. She pokes her head in his bedroom just at the same time that Vince is coming out of the bathroom, and he's wearing only his underwear, his briefs. She kind of has a start, as you might expect, turns away, blocks her eyes, whatever. He kind of laughs, shakes it off. Oh, don't worry about it. Kind of throws his shirt at her so that she'll help him with the buttons, kind of a thing. He kind of laughs it off. It doesn't really make him uncomfortable at all. But he does tell her, I guess this is sort of the first time that he kind of reminds her that the true nature of their relationship needs to be kept a secret. So here you kind of have the first time that Vince is sort of establishing that level of secrecy between them sort of explicitly, right? Before he was kind of implicitly saying like, hey, just tell him we met through a mutual friend, that kind of a thing. And now it's much more like, hey, this is our little secret. And it's the first real time you kind of see this dissonance, this very clear dissonance between his level of comfort and her level of comfort. And you can just kind of see the situation growing at this point. It's sort of starting to take shape. Vince's intentions are starting to really take shape. On April 21st, Grant meets Vince at his condo, and basically he assures her that she will be hearing from WWE soon about a potential employment opportunity. He also demonstrates the use of a massager on her back. This was kind of weird. I'm not exactly sure why this was included. Obviously, it's inappropriate in any kind of professional setting, but they don't really have a professional relationship except for this one conversation. I mean, at this point, they don't. Except for the one conversation between WWE Corporate Officer number 2 and Grant, there hasn't been any offer of employment. It would appear that she's only seen him at his condo. So it's really only been a personal setting. Yeah, they've had professional discussions or whatever, but so far there's like a lot of personal and like no professional at all associated with it. So it's kind of like he kind of like pulls this massager and sort of demonstrates its use on her back. Doesn't really indicate that it makes her particularly uncomfortable at the time that it happens, but the lawsuit notes that it occurs. 9 days later, she meets with 2 high-ranking but unnamed WWE HR employees. And basically they tell her that they are looking for the best place to put her in the organization, but that they haven't found it yet. So it kind of seems like they're just trying to keep her interested in the role, or trying to show her that they're continuously keeping the ball moving forward, even though it may not look like it from the outside. On May 5th, 2019, Grant yet again visits Vince's townhouse, and they talk again. She mentions that she always wanted, somehow the topic of bucket lists comes up during their conversation, and she mentions how she always wanted to go to the Belmont Stakes, famous horse race, and he immediately says, well, I'll get you tickets now. She kind of, not scoffs at it, but I think the lawsuit indicates that she mentions that it would be inappropriate for something like that to happen, given that she's looking for a job. And at that point, Vince gets up from his chair, crosses over to her, kneels in front of her chair. The lawsuit specifically states that he does it in a way that prevents her from getting up, which obviously very important language there, right? He has to do that in a way that physically prevents her from leaving the situation. Otherwise, she could just turn and walk away. And he basically requests a kiss. She pauses, considers it, then leans in and kisses him on the cheek, to which he responds, "That's not what I meant." Vince stands and heads for his bedroom, telling her he, and this is a direct quote, wants her. She refuses, which apparently basically just leads to Vince just like explicitly begging her for some kind of physical connection. And basically what follows is this kind of awkward negotiation where she basically agrees to lay on the bed with him on top of the covers with her hands clasped together and her legs crossed on the bed. So you can kind of close your eyes for a second and imagine kind of the weird awkwardness of this situation. Vince McMahon is cuddling up to this woman who's half his age, and she's sort of laying there uncomfortably on top of the covers, like not exactly sure what to do. At least that's the impression that the lawsuit kind of leaves with you. Begrudgingly, she lays on the bed, hands clasped and legs crossed, and allows Vince to hold her. 4 days later, on May 9th, Vince promises Grant that she will be employed by WWE by the end of the week, by Friday. On one day later, on May 10th, Grant has several calls with multiple WWE employees, and at 7 p.m. is basically told, welcome to the WWE. The next day, May 11th, Vince invites Grant back to his condo, and he asks her to lay with him again, and tells her that she was hired even though a job description hadn't even been prepared yet. So again, we see from the last visit an escalation in the nature of the relationship, right? It's the frog boiling in the pot. It's one little step at a time. And now we kind of see Vince is sort of pitching like, hey, I'm doing you this huge favor here, right? Like, you don't really deserve this. You didn't really go through the interview process. We don't even really have a job. We don't even have a job description. And yet here you are basically with this job in your hands. So kind of creating this dynamic of not necessarily quid pro quo at this point, but kind of this like, you owe me a favor type situation. On May 16th, 2019, Vince secures Belmont Stakes tickets, or at least tells her that he has secured tickets for Belmont Stakes. Following day, on the 17th, is when Grant receives her official offer letter for a position with the title Legal Administrator Coordinator role, which has a starting salary of $75,000. I don't have any idea what that. I mean, to me, that's like a low level kind of starter type role. I mean, they're in Stamford, Connecticut, New York City area, not a cheap area to live. So while that definitely doesn't rise to the level that Grant ends up being at, 2-3 years down the road as the story progresses, it represents sort of a foot in the door and kind of where you would expect somebody that's just getting into the business might start. But again, pretty nondescript title there, Legal Administrator Coordinator. The following day, on May 18th, Grant returns to Vince's condo, and she informs her that her boss will be a, quote, member of the Titan family who, quote, helped WWE expand from a regional promotion to a global juggernaut. So what Vince basically tells her is that she's going to be reporting to a guy who is basically Vince McMahon's hatchet man. Supposedly, besides Vince's personal attorney, this guy is the most feared member of the company because he's the one that fires everybody. You don't want to have a meeting with this guy in the legal department. Again, he's supposedly a member of the Titan family, somebody that's been with him for decades, conceivably, and I kind of get this impression that he kind of works as Vince's hatchet man. Again, that's my impression. That's my opinion there. That is not explicitly stated in the lawsuit at any point, but that's the impression that's pretty clearly given. During the visit, Vince pressured Grant to engage in sexual activity. She gives in, and Vince engages in what Grant describes as a, quote, non-consensual sexual encounter, including oral and vaginal sex with her, while saying things like, "This is what I've been waiting for," and "Okay, jack him off." The lawsuit does mention that there was some disassociation that occurs that perhaps is a bit of a turnoff for Vince, is sort of the implication. Again, I'm not going to get into the lurid details, but it's at this point you can sort of see that the relationship has sort of solidified at this point, right? She's got the job offer in hand. She signed it. Vince now has control over her financially. He's worked for months to establish a high level of personal comfort. As far as the lawsuit indicates, she hasn't even been to WWE headquarters at this point. She's been to Vince's condo on maybe a dozen occasions in the last 2 months, but she's only talked on the phone with HR people, with WWE corporate officer number 2, whoever that is. So she's talked to some people on the phone, and she's met with Vince in what appears to be a personal capacity multiple times. And yet she's holding this job offer in her hand for this made-up position at this salary this entry-level salary, that where did it come from? So you can kind of see Vince has already established this sort of you owe me dynamic. And now this crossing that threshold into sexual contact, direct sexual contact, kind of solidifies the relationship. And now it becomes sort of a quid pro quo situation. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, right? I get you a job, you provide me with sexual favors. And this is sort of the first time that relationship really solidifies almost 2 months after their first meeting. Fast forward almost an entire month to June 16th. On the day before she was set to start with WWE, Grant attempts to shut down any physical relationship between them, and Vince refuses. So she kind of, again, this is what the lawsuit indicates as another opportunity for her to back out. So, yeah, she signed the offer letter. Yeah, she's met with some people, but she hasn't officially begun her role with WWE. And so the lawsuit would indicate that she sees this as her opportunity to kind of back out of the personal relationship with Vince and try to pursue things professionally with the company. And Vince basically flat out refuses it. For him, I think that the solidification, like I said, that quid pro quo establishment that they came to the month before, that becomes the new normal. And now it's a situation where if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. And all bets are off. This quid pro quo is the new normal going forward. It's the way it has to be, and it's the way that it's going to be. So this brings us to the conclusion of part 2. You can see the grooming begins. It's a slow escalation over multiple months, right? First it starts with talking, then it starts with personal talk, then we move on to physical touch, then we move on to sort of borderline inappropriate physical touch, right? Then we move on to use of the massager. Then once the job situation starts to solidify, then the physical relationship starts to solidify, and the two of them become inextricably linked together in this sort of back and forth quid pro quo type situation. Up next is part 3, which I've titled Miss Grant Goes to Stamford. We're going to talk about, this is early summer of 2019, we're going to talk about sort of the nature of her job. She has her first day at WWE. What's the job like? What are her coworkers like? What's the environment? What's the situation like? And we'll start to see how, despite the fact that Vince keeps insisting that, that it needs to be a big secret and that things need to be kept separate, the lines between personal and professional tend to blur very deeply when it comes to the world of WWE and Vince McMahon. So, if you've stayed with me till now, thanks very much for being with me. Please be sure to check out part 3. The next part, Miss Grant Goes to Stamford. And keep watching, and we'll keep wrestling with the business.